They dragged her to the gallows like she was already dead. No trial, no mercy, just a rope and a lie. But one man rode into that chaos, cut the noose, and dared the whole town to stop him. What followed wasn't just justice. It was the kind of reckoning legends are born from. A shocking revelation comes next. But before we uncover the truth that shook the entire frontier, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss more stories like this, where one decision can change everything. The noose swung gently in the wind, creaking against the old oak's thick branch, like it had a memory of the last neck it snapped. And in the fading light of a Grayson sundown, folks gathered with the kind of quiet anticipation usually reserved for fireworks or a Sunday sermon. Dust rolled through the air, catching in beards and bonnets, and the heat clung to skin like guilt no one wanted to name. At the center of it all was a girl, no more than 16, dirt on her cheeks, wrists bound with frayed rope, eyes burning not with fear, but with something sharper. Tala. That's all she gave them. No last name, no sobbing pleas, just that name, and a silence that unnerved even the men paid to drag her through the dust. Sheriff Kane stood by the tree with a cigarette burning low, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat, hands resting on his belt like he hoped the badge could keep his conscience quiet. The crime? Theft, they said. Stolen brooch from the mayor's wife. A trinket not worth half the bloodlust it sparked. But it wasn't about a brooch. It never was. It was about fear dressed up as law. About land claims the girl's father once refused to sell. About skin too dark and silence too proud for a place like Grayson. No trial, no jury, just rope, oak, and rage. As the preacher fumbled through half-hearted scripture and the hangman checked the knot, murmurs rolled through the crowd, bets, jokes, and the occasional prayer wrapped in spit. Tala didn't cry, didn't blink. She stood tall as the stool was placed beneath her, as the rope was slipped around her neck. As the sun touched the horizon and the shadows began to stretch long and hungry across the town square. Somewhere, a raven croaked. Somewhere, a mother clutched her child's hand tighter. And just as the hangman raised his hand, ready to send a girl swinging into history, a rider appeared on the far end of the street, dust curling behind him like smoke from something about to burn. The rope had just gone taut, the hangman's hand dropping like a judge's gavel, when the rider thundered through the square. One man, one horse, no warning. And what happened next unfolded with the precision of an old wound reopening. Dust exploded beneath hooves as the stranger dismounted in a single fluid motion, long coat trailing behind him like a flag torn from whatever side he'd once fought for. No one moved at first, stunned into stillness by the audacity of it. Then the shouting started. But he didn't flinch, didn't raise a weapon, just walked straight through the press of bodies, eyes fixed on the gallows like the rest of the world was an afterthought. Tala dangled above the stool, boots twitching, lips parted but silent, her eyes wide but dry. The stranger climbed the platform with the calm of a man, going somewhere he'd already been in a dream, and from his belt he drew a blade. Not flashy, not long, just a work knife with a handle worn smooth from use. With one clean motion, he cut the rope, and Tala dropped like a stone, coughing, gasping, hitting the planks with the sound of life refusing to leave. The crowd erupted, half screams, half curses, men reaching for rifles and pistols like honor demanded it. But the man didn't run, didn't reach for steel. He turned to face them, just stood there, boots planted, chest rising slow, knife still in hand. His eyes scanned the faces, not with panic, but with quiet calculation, the kind of gaze that measured 100 men and found most of them lacking. The sheriff didn't move. The preacher stepped back. And for a moment, in that narrow breath between violence and legend, the town of Grayson paused, not because it had found its conscience, but because it didn't yet understand what kind of man had just walked into its shame and made it flinch. The rope lay curled on the ground like a snake with its head cut off. And beside it stood a man whose silence said plainly, "If you hang her, you'll have to hang me too." The dust hadn't even settled from the gallows disruption when the townsfolk began to surge forward, shouts rising like a fever breaking. "Hang 'em both! Get the rope again! She'll run if you don't kill her now!" But Tala didn't move, didn't flinch. Her neck bore the red mark of the noose, raw and angry like the town that had placed it there, but she stood tall behind the man who had cut her down, spine straight, eyes forward. There was no tremble in her knees, no tears in her eyes, just a fire so sharp it looked like it could set tinder alight with a stare. The girl was barefoot, bound no longer by rope, but by something stronger, defiance forged in grief. The stranger had drawn a line with his blade, but Tala held it with her posture. She didn't hide behind him. She stood in his shadow like she was part of it. A woman spat at her feet. A drunk miner tried to lunge forward, only to be caught by his own hesitation when the stranger stepped once to the side and met his eyes. And still, Tala stood silent, her chest rising steady, like this wasn't the first time the world had decided her life was worth less than a brooch or a border. Somewhere in the crowd, a rancher muttered, "That girl's got ice in her bones." But it wasn't ice. It was history. It was memory. It was blood that remembered what happened when people bowed their heads and begged. Her father had been a chief, her mother a teacher, and both were buried in the soil of lands, now fenced by men who claimed to have bought it. Tala was no thief. She had been born with less than most, but what she had, she'd never stolen, only carried. Now, surrounded by rage and rope, she didn't plead for her life. She claimed it, with silence, with stillness, with the kind of quiet that unnerves mobs and makes cowards look to their feet. Whatever came next, she had already decided. She would not run from them, and she would not break for them. She would make them break first. Sheriff Kane stood at the cracked window of his office, arms folded tight across a chest full of old regrets and fresh cowardice, the brim of his hat shadowing eyes that had seen more than they'd ever report. From where he watched, the gallows looked like an altar, the crowd like a congregation that didn't come for salvation but for sacrifice. And he, the law, was their mute priest. He hadn't moved when the girl was dragged into town, hadn't lifted a hand when the mob called for blood. Over a brooch they couldn't prove was even missing. And he didn't stir now, even after the stranger carved their justice in half with a blade. Kane knew the girl's name, knew her father's name, too, Saka, a man with calloused hands and a spine like iron, who once rode into town to negotiate grazing rights and left with bullets in his back and lies on his death certificate. He'd heard the girl's story, same as he'd heard the land deed rumors, same as he'd heard how that brooch had suddenly gone missing after she refused to serve drinks to the mayor's son. But Grayson didn't run on truth. It ran on appearances, on order, on money passed under tables, and hatred passed over fences. Justice in Canestown, was a puppet in a starched collar, and he was too old, too tired, too paid off to cut its strings. So he stood behind the glass, fingers twitching at the edge of his holster, not out of intention but habit, as if part of him still remembered what it felt like to act instead of watch. Below, the stranger stood calm and ready. The girl stood unbroken, and the town boiled like a pot left too long in silence. Kane could have stopped it all, could have opened his door, raised his voice, reminded them what a badge once meant. But he didn't. Because silence don't echo like gunfire. Because keeping his mouth shut never got him killed. Because the gallows weren't just outside his window. They were inside him too. And deep down, he knew the real rope wasn't around the girl's neck. It was coiled tight around his soul, and he'd tied every loop himself. Colt Brannigan didn't ask permission, didn't wait for the crowd to settle into a second frenzy. He just swung Tala up behind him, clicked his tongue, and rode out of Grayson like hell itself had whispered the root. The hooves of his mare, Dustwitch, beat a steady rhythm against the dry, packed earth, a sound that cut through the shouted threats and startled curses like a war drum echoing into the dying light. Behind them, the town thrashed in confusion, some reaching for rifles, others for whiskey, and a few just standing dumbfounded, as if justice itself had come and gone before they could name it. Colt knew they'd ride after him, knew that men who felt embarrassed turned cruel quick, and mobs that lost their grip on a noose often reached for guns instead. But he didn't look back, not once. He felt Tala's fingers grip the back of his coat, not in fear, not even in gratitude, but in the steady way someone holds on when they know falling isn't an option. The wind burned their faces as they rode into the open scrubland, sagebrush hissing past like snakes too tired to strike, and the sky bruised purple and gold above them. Colt's mind didn't wander. He didn't have that luxury. Every hoofbeat meant they were one step farther from the rope, and one step closer to the crosshairs of every deputy, bounty hunter, and would-be hero who wanted their names etched into the tale of the outlaw who robbed Grayson of its spectacle. He wasn't running to safety. There wasn't any. He was running to delay the reckoning, to give the girl breathing room, to turn a gallows tale into something more than bones and memory. In the distance, a hawk circled. Colt squinted into the dying sun and said nothing, because words were too heavy for men with blood in their wake and fire in their future. By the time night fell, the moon would rise over a trail cut by two ghosts who refused to die quiet, and the hunt would begin. Bearclaw Ridge rose out of the land like a spine cracked through the earth's skin, jagged, narrow, and quiet until it wasn't. Colt had counted on the ridge giving them a vantage point, maybe even a few minutes of calm, but the posse came quicker than expected. 5 riders, dust trailing behind them like smoke from a fuse, already lit. The moment Colt saw their silhouettes slicing the skyline, he told Tala to stay low, then slipped off Dustwitch with a cold efficiency born of too many close calls. The fight wasn't clean. Fights never are. The first man rode too fast into the blind corner of the rocks and caught Colt's blade across the neck, the sound wet and final. The second raised a shotgun, but hesitated just long enough to catch a bullet to the gut. Colt's aim steady, breath even, like he wasn't just buying time, but issuing a toll. The third, younger than the rest, and already shaking, managed to fire wild, clipping Colt's shoulder, but he didn't finish the job. Colt knocked him cold with the butt of his pistol and left him bleeding against the stone. The other two scattered, unsure whether to fight or flee, and Colt let them go. Not out of mercy, but strategy. The wounded talk. They carry stories with panic in their voice, and panic spreads faster than bullets. Blood pooled between the rocks, mixing with dust and the broken bits of spent lead. Tala had watched the whole thing, crouched but not hidden, her face blank but her eyes wide, like someone learning just how far a man will go to stand against the rope. Colt didn't speak after. He just reloaded in silence, tied off the bleeding on his arm with part of his shirt, and signaled with a nod. They rode again, two silhouettes slipping through the ridgeline, one trailing pain, the other purpose. Behind them, the rocks whispered the names of the dead. Ahead, the night waited like a question, with no clean answer. The fire cracked low beneath a pot of beans neither of them touched, and the stars hung heavy above like watchful eyes refusing to blink. Colt sat with his back to the canyon wall, one hand resting on his pistol, the other nursing the throb in his shoulder. Tala, wrapped in an old army blanket he'd pulled from his saddlebag, stared into the flames, like they were trying to show her something buried deep. When she spoke, her voice didn't shake. It didn't ask for pity. It told the truth, like it had waited too long to be believed. Her father, Nahuel, was a tribal leader, not in feathers and ceremony, but in quiet counsel, in stubborn resolve, in dignity, that didn't bend even when the ranchers came with their papers and lies. They wanted grazing rights, then water rights, then the whole damn creek. Nahuel refused. Said the land fed too many mouths to sell it off like cattle. A week later, he was found with a bullet in his neck and a forged land deed in his saddlebag. Sheriff Kane called it suicide. No investigation, no questions. The town nodded along, eager for new pastures and clean consciences. Tala was 16, too young to fight, too angry to forget. She'd been biding her time, collecting bits and pieces of her father's dealings, documents he hid beneath floorboards, letters he never sent. And when she tried to bring one to the preacher's wife for safekeeping, the mayor's son accused her of stealing that brooch, said he saw her slip it into her pocket. No trial, just a rope, and a crowd full of neighbors who once smiled at her mother's bread, now screaming for her neck. She paused then, poking the fire with a stick, and said, "I didn't cry when they dragged me. I only cried when I saw Kane look away." The silence after felt louder than gunfire. Colt didn't speak, didn't need to. The flames crackled between them, two fugitives bound by truth no one else had the stomach to face. That night, neither of them slept, not because of fear, but because justice, once named, does not let go easy. The trail to Fort Mercy was long and quiet, the kind of silence that let old ghosts wake up and stretch their limbs. The fort hadn't flown a flag in over a decade, just bones of stone and sun-bleached timber now, crawling with ivy and regret. Colt hadn't planned to come back here. He never did. But the wound in his shoulder was getting mean, and the world was getting smaller behind them. So he turned his horse toward the place where he once learned how to shoot without blinking and obey without asking. Fort Mercy had been a line in the sand during the wars, a place men like Colt were sent to hold ground, spill blood, and forget names. He'd done his time there, done things in the name of the Union that kept him awake even when whiskey tried to knock him out. He hadn't buried men there. He'd buried parts of himself, morals, questions. One night, after a raid, they were ordered to call a sweep. He'd stayed behind, to dig graves for women and children whose names he never learned. Tala noticed his grip tighten on the reins as they passed through the broken gate. But she didn't ask. Maybe she knew. Maybe she didn't need to. The wind moaned through the empty watchtowers like a hymn sung by the dead, and the barracks creaked in protest as Colt led them into what was left of the infirmary, a stone shell still sturdy enough to keep out a storm. He poured stale water into a tin basin, cleaned his wound, and stitched it with shaking fingers. Tala explored in silence, her footsteps soft among the splinters of forgotten wars. As dusk fell, Colt leaned against the wall, eyes scanning the hills like the war had never ended. Because maybe it hadn't. Maybe it had just changed uniforms. Fort Mercy wasn't shelter. It was a reminder, a place where orders used to matter more than right. Now, surrounded by the ghosts he'd earned and the girl he'd saved, Colt wondered what kind of man he really was, and whether mercy ever had a place in a land that kept trying to hang it. By the time the sun climbed over Fort Mercy's crumbling walls, Colt's face was already nailed to every saloon door and church bulletin from Bisbee to Whetstone Ridge. The posters weren't printed. They were sketched by hand, fast and angry, with lines that made him look more outlaw than man. Wanted, Colt Brannigan, for murder, assault, aiding fugitives, and inciting rebellion. Beneath the list of crimes sat a number so high it made bounty hunters salivate and decent men reconsider their definition of justice. The law branded him traitor. The townsfolk called him fool. But in the hills and canyons, where whispers carried farther than horses could run, some started calling him something else: protector, witness, reckoner. It didn't matter much to Colt. Names were weightless compared to the steel he now had to carry on both hips. He knew how these things moved. A man becomes a symbol the second he defies the noose in public. The moment he cuts a rope, people stop seeing flesh and start seeing legend. And legends draw blades, bullets, and men eager to be the one who silences them. Even the army took notice. Colonel Graves, a man Colt remembered too well from the war, had sent out scouts with orders not to arrest, but to contain by any means necessary. Graves never did like loose ends or old soldiers who remembered too much. Tala watched Colt as he scanned one of the posters, brow furrowed, mouth set like granite. She said nothing, just touched the edge of the paper like it might bleed. "Looks like you saved the wrong girl," she muttered dryly. Colt didn't flinch. "No," he said, folding the poster in half and tossing it into the fire. "I saved the right one. It's the rest of them that got it wrong." Outside, the wind picked up, scattering ashes into the sky like sparks looking for kindling. The world was closing in now, fast, loud, and merciless. But Colt didn't saddle up. Not yet. A man with a price on his head has two choices: hide until he's forgotten, or ride until he's remembered. And Colt Brannigan had never been one to disappear. They rode 2 days through Dry Gulch and Mesquite Scrub to find the only man Colt thought might still carry a spine beneath his robes, Judge Harland Webb, long retired, half blind, but still sharp enough to smell a lie from 100 yards. He lived alone now, tucked away in a canyon shack built from court benches and old rifle crates, a relic himself, part lawman, part ghost. Colt had saved him once during a skirmish near Antelope Creek, dragging him out of a burning wagon while bullets tore the sky like thunder. Back then, Harlan had sworn a debt, but war promises fade fast in the face of frontier politics. When Colt explained everything, Tala's story, the forged deed, the hanging, the sheriff's silence. Harland listened without a blink, swirling his coffee like it held the answer. Finally, he stood, walked to a trunk covered in dust and shame, and pulled out his old gavel. Its handle splintered, its head cracked down the middle, like justice itself had given up halfway through a verdict. "Colt," he said, voice heavy with the weight of too many gray hairs. "There ain't a court in Arizona that'll hear this. Not unless you walk in with papers, names, maybe a corpse or two." He laid the gavel on the table like a dead thing. "They've made you an outlaw, and outlaws don't get trials. They get trees." Tala stood in the doorway, shoulders square, eyes burning with the same fire Colt had seen under that hanging tree. "Then we bring them what they can't ignore," she said. "We bring them proof." Harlan gave a tired smile. "You bring proof, girl. You better bring a coffin for it, too." Outside, the wind kicked dust against the windows, as if the land itself wanted the past to stay buried. But Colt knew the truth. Some things don't stay buried. Not forever, especially when they've been waiting this long to speak. He nodded once, slow and certain. They'd find the evidence, and when they did, that broken gavel would have to rise one last time. If not for justice, then at least for reckoning. The morning after Judge Webb's verdict, Tala sat sharpening a knife that had never drawn blood, her hands steady, her eyes distant. "He kept records," she said, barely above a whisper. "My father. Every meeting, every bribe offer, every forged mark. Said truth was useless unless you nailed it down in ink." She told Colt the ledger was hidden deep in Silvershade Mine, an old tunnel north of Grayson, long collapsed and forgotten by all but those who needed it hidden. Colt didn't argue. He just saddled up. The ride back toward Grayson felt like heading straight into a fire you'd only barely outrun. Every hilltop could hold a rifle. Every shadow might speak his name in a bounty hunter's breath. But he went anyway, because Tala didn't ask him to. She just said the words, and he understood. When they reached the mouth of the mine, choked with sagebrush and silence, it felt more like entering a grave than a tunnel. The air was stale, metallic, like blood that had dried long ago and refused to forget it. With a lantern swinging low, they followed the rotting tracks into the earth. The walls close and damp, the darkness pressing like a second skin. Deeper in, Tala led him to a bricked-up alcove near a collapsed shaft. She knelt and scraped back the stones with a flat rock until her fingers found something smooth, an oilskin bundle, tight and stained. Inside, the ledger, dozens of entries, handwritten, precise, dates, signatures, sketches of deeds, names of men who now sat on Grayson's town council or rode with the sheriff's badge pinned proud to their chest. Colt flipped through the pages, face lit only by the trembling flame of the lantern. "This," he said, "isn't just proof. This is a war drum." Tala looked up at him, dust streaking her face like war paint. "Then let's beat it loud enough to wake the whole damn frontier." Behind them, the mine groaned, as if the mountain itself disapproved. But they didn't stop. Truth may have been buried here, but now it had breath. And Colt Brannigan didn't plan on letting it die quiet. They came back to Grayson like ghosts, quiet as breath, riding the edge of moonlight through cottonwoods and dry creek beds where only owls bore witness. The town hadn't changed in the week since Colt cut the rope. It still reeked of dust, sweat, and the kind of fear that calls itself order. But now every lantern burned longer, every shadow was twice checked, and the gallows stood rebuilt. Its rope looped like a question mark. The town refused to stop asking. Colt knew the risks. His wanted posters still flapped on the general store's porch, curling in the night breeze like warnings from the devil himself. But they weren't here to hide. They were here to end it. Tala wore her father's knife, strapped to her thigh, and carried the ledger like scripture. Her silence wasn't fear, it was purpose. They left their horses tied in the arroyo, west of the livery, then crept through back alleys and butcher sheds, until they reached the church at the edge of town, where Reverend Thorne, one of the few men left with a spine, kept his door unlocked for those who came with ghosts. He barely blinked when Colt stepped in, bloody and dust-worn, followed by the girl whose hanging he'd quietly prayed against. "We need the pulpit," Colt said, voice low but steady. Thorne nodded and lit a candle. The plan was simple. At dawn, the whole town would gather for Sunday service, same as always. Only this time, the sermon would come from the mouths of the condemned, and the ledger would serve as gospel. "You sure this'll work?" Tala asked as they waited in the dark. Colt looked out the stained glass window at the hanging tree silhouetted against the night sky. "Doesn't have to work," he said. "It just has to be loud enough they can't pretend they didn't hear it." The church creaked in the wind. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once and went quiet. The hours stretched thin. Dawn was coming. So was judgment. And for the first time in a long while, Grayson might finally be forced to see itself by daylight. The sun rose blood orange over Grayson, casting long shadows from the gallows that loomed like a threat carved in wood. The crowd gathered again, some out of duty, some out of curiosity, and more than a few out of hate. Sheriff Kane stood smug beneath the hanging tree, flanked by deputies with twitchy fingers and 2 clean boots. Tala was dragged forward in chains, her face hard as stone, her eyes locked on the horizon, like she already knew someone was coming. And someone did. Colt Brannigan stepped through the crowd like a storm in boots, dust-covered, rifle slung over one shoulder, and in his hand, held high for all to see, the tattered leather ledger. The crowd went still, like breath had been sucked out of the whole town at once. "Before you hang another innocent," Colt called out, voice rough but unshaken, "you ought to read what her father died trying to record." He tossed the ledger at the sheriff's feet, where it landed with a thud loud enough to echo off every conscience in town. Kane sneered, but when he bent to open it, his face changed, just slightly. Enough for those watching to see something crack behind the badge. Names, deeds, payoffs, everything. Reverend Thorne stepped forward and read aloud, voice shaking but strong, as the townsfolk leaned in, faces folding into themselves, neighbors recognizing neighbors in the inked betrayals. One of the councilmen turned pale. Another backed away. A woman wept softly into her apron. "You hang her now," Colt said, leveling his rifle. "You do it knowing the truth. And I promise you, every man here will live long enough to regret what that rope stands for." Tala stood taller, the chains on her wrists now sounding more like bells than shackles. The silence was total. Even the wind had the decency to hold its breath. Then, slowly, someone stepped away from the crowd. Then another, then a third. The noose swung in the breeze, untouched. Kane stared at the girl, then the rifle, then the pages that damned him, and for the first time, his silence cost him more than his pride. Justice hadn't arrived in a courtroom. It came in boots, with ink, lead, and fire. For a heartbeat, it seemed the air itself refused to move. Then Sheriff Kane's hand twitched toward his holster, slow like molasses, but shaking all the same. Colt didn't flinch. Neither did Tala. But it wasn't a bullet that stopped the sheriff. It was the butcher's son, elbowing through the crowd with a length of rawhide rope and fury in his eyes. Then came the blacksmith, then old Miss Dyer from the post office. Her voice quivering like gunpowder lit at the fuse. "You lied to us," she said. "You lied for years." The crowd, once passive as sheep, turned restless, their faces now carved with something deeper than rage: shame. Kane backed up, barking orders, but the deputies had vanished like smoke. Alone, he looked smaller than he ever had, all shine and no spine. Colt didn't raise his rifle. He didn't need to. The ledger had done the shooting. The gallows loomed behind them, cruel and silent, the rope still swinging gently like a question, yet to be answered. And then, without a vote, without a speech, the answer came. The same townsfolk who watched Tala nearly die minutes before now dragged their sheriff towards the steps, their fury quiet, righteous, final. Kane screamed about law, about duty, about how they needed him, but no one listened. The rope that had waited for Tala now kissed Kane's neck. He clawed, begged, cursed. The trapdoor dropped, and silence followed. Not horror, not glee, just a long, bitter quiet. Tala stood beside Colt, unchained, shoulders square. Justice hadn't come with a badge or a bench. It had come from the same people who once demanded her death. The same hands that built the gallows had turned it into a monument, not of punishment, but of reckoning. Grayson didn't cheer. They just stood there, each one staring into the empty sky like trying to remember when it was they'd stopped seeing the truth. And when the sun dipped low again, casting shadows long and lean across the dust, no one looked at the rope the same way. Not ever again. The town tried to thank him, offered a pardon, a warm bed, even a badge, but Colt Brannigan only nodded once, slow and polite, then saddled his horse without a word. Tala stood beside him, hair unbound in the wind, her eyes no longer wary, but wide with something close to peace. She could have asked him to stay. He would have stayed too, if the world were kinder, if men like him belonged anywhere after pulling the veil off a place's soul. But justice, real justice, doesn't leave a man cleaner. It just peels off the masks until all that's left is the scar underneath. Colt tipped his hat to her, said her name one last time, like it mattered, and rode west before the sun could climb too high, casting his shadow long across the gallows, wood still stained from the morning. Behind him, Grayson stood stunned, and quieter than it had in years, as if the truth had drained the poison, but left the wound wide open. People would rebuild, re-elect, replant what they could, but that gallows would stay standing, not as a tool, but a reminder of how close they came to killing the wrong soul for the wrong reason. As for Tala, she stayed. She stayed and lived loud and honest, built her father's land back up with her own hands, and made sure no one ever forgot what justice looks like when it rides in dirty and leaves quieter than thunder. And Colt? He disappeared into legend, a man who once cut a rope not just to save a girl, but to strangle a lie. No one knew where he went. Some said north, others whispered Mexico. But whenever a town turned cruel, or the noose came too fast, folks swore they saw him at the edge of the dust, just watching. Not saving, just watching. Because some men don't chase peace, they ride past it. And justice, when it's real, never stays put. It just keeps riding, one town too far, and one wrong too many.